Title: The Entire Mongol Empire, History for Sleep, 1 hour, Dusk and Empires, History for Sleep. Target runtime, 58 to 65 minutes. Approximate character count, 58,000 plus characters. Voice notes: deep male voice. Age mature and wise. Pace 80 to 85 dpm. Warmth with gravitas. Think a grandfather telling stories by firelight, never rushing, always present. No dramatic peaks, only gentle waves of revelation. Soft, warm tone, no music under, just your voice and silence. Close your eyes now. Let the world outside this moment fall away. Somewhere far beneath the surface of modern maps and modern names, there exists a landscape that remembers. The steppes of Central Asia, vast grasslands that stretch like a green ocean across the belly of the earth. Miles and miles of wind-bent grass, beneath skies so large they seem to contain entire universes. For thousands of years, nomadic peoples have moved across these grasslands. They knew the land as a living thing. They understood the rhythm of seasons, the migration of herds, the relationship between sky and earth and horse and human. In these grasslands, there were no walls, no boundaries drawn by hands. There was only movement, only possibility. And from this landscape, from these people, these horses, these traditions of mobility and survival, there would emerge in the 12th century a figure who would change the world forever. His name was Temujin. He was born into obscurity and hardship, and he would become Genghis Khan. Tonight, we journey through the rise and reign of the Mongol Empire. We travel from the grasslands of Mongolia through the conquered cities of Asia, across deserts and mountains, through periods of peace and violence, of cultural synthesis and loss. We witness the transformation of a nomadic people into the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever known. But this is not a story of simple conquest. It is a story of survival, of vision, of a man who rose from nothing and a people who adapted to rule over others. It is a story that shaped continents and centuries. So let yourself drift backward in time. Feel the ground beneath you change from settled earth to open grassland. The air grows cooler, drier. Hear the distant cry of an eagle. Feel the weight of history settle upon your shoulders like a blanket. Not heavy, but present. Comforting. We begin now in the 12th century on the steppes of Mongolia. Let the telling begin. Warm, almost contemplative tone. To understand Genghis Khan, we must first understand the world he was born into. The Mongolian steppes in the 12th century were not empty lands. They were inhabited by various nomadic peoples, Tatars, Karaite, Naimans, and many others, each with their own tribes, their own traditions, their own understanding of survival in one of the harshest environments on earth. These were people of the horse. The horse was not merely transportation for them. It was existence itself. A man's wealth was measured in horses. His status depended on how many he owned, how well he could ride, how skillfully he could use a bow from horseback. And the land itself, this endless grassland, demanded respect. Winters on the steppes were brutal beyond imagination. Spring could arrive suddenly or late, leaving people on the edge of starvation. Summers were brief and precious. There were no permanent settlements, no stored grain in granaries, no city walls to shelter behind. There was only the cycle of seasons and the skill of the people who navigated them. The tribes of the steppes were often at war with one another. These were not wars of conquest in any grand sense. They were struggles over pasture land, over disputes about honor and kinship, over resources that meant the difference between survival and starvation. Young men proved themselves in battle. Raiding was not considered shameful. It was a way of life, a way of accumulating wealth and reputation. Into this world, sometime around 1162 AD, a child was born whose name was Temujin. We do not know the exact year of his birth. The sources vary, and precision matters less in oral traditions than truth. What we do know is that he was born into a family of modest means, the Kiat clan, and that his early life was marked by hardship and loss. His father was a chieftain named Yesuge, a man of some standing among the tribes. But Yesuge died when Temujin was only 9 years old, poisoned, as the story goes, by rivals of a neighboring tribe. With his father dead, Temujin and his family lost status almost immediately. They became vulnerable. In the harsh logic of the steppes, a family without a strong man to lead them was prey. When Temujin was young, perhaps 10 or 11, he was captured in a raid by the Tatar tribe. the same people who had, according to tradition, killed his father. He was held captive, treated poorly, but he managed to escape and return to his family. These experiences, the loss of his father, the humiliation of captivity, the struggle to survive, would shape the man he would become. They taught him that the old system of tribal warfare and raiding was chaotic, destructive, and unsustainable. As Temujin grew older, he began to gather followers. This was remarkable because he did not come from a position of supreme power or wealth. Instead, he attracted people through a combination of personal magnetism, military skill, and something even more valuable, loyalty. He rewarded those who served him faithfully. He punished betrayal ruthlessly, and he offered something the steppes had never seen before, the possibility of unity. Around 1180, Temujin entered into an alliance with a man named Togrul Khan, a member of the Karait tribe who had himself risen to prominence. Togrul Khan treated Temujin as a son, and for a time, this alliance was genuine and mutually beneficial. With Togrul Khan's support, Temujin's power grew. He defeated the Tartars and other rival tribes. He gathered more followers. His reputation spread across the grasslands, but the relationship with Togrul Khan would not last. In time, as Temujin grew stronger, the older chieftain began to see him as a threat rather than a protege. They eventually came to war. In 1202, Temujin defeated Togrul Khan in battle. The man who had once been his mentor was forced to flee, eventually dying in exile. Temujin had proven himself superior, not through birthright, but through military genius and the loyalty he had cultivated. In the years that followed, Temujin systematized his approach to conquest. He did not simply defeat rival tribes and move on. He absorbed them into his growing confederation. He took the best warriors and incorporated them into his growing force. He broke old tribal structures and reorganized people according to merit and loyalty rather than kinship. Those who served him well were rewarded with treasure and status. Those who betrayed him were eliminated without mercy. This was revolutionary on the steppes. The old system had been based on tribe and clan. You were born into your place, and that determined your future. Temujin offered something different, a meritocratic system where a man could rise through skill, courage, and loyalty. For many people living in constant instability and danger, this was profoundly appealing. By 1206, Temujin had unified the Mongol tribes and defeated or absorbed nearly all rival powers on the steppes. In that year, at a Kurultai, a gathering of tribal leaders and warriors, he was proclaimed Genghis Khan, which means universal ruler, or oceanic ruler. The name itself carried a kind of poetry. Just as the ocean has no fixed borders and encompasses all waters, so too would his rule have no fixed boundaries. But unifying the steppes was only the beginning. Genghis Khan now turned his attention outward. Beyond the grasslands, he could see wealthy cities, settled kingdoms, and civilizations that had grown soft and divided. The Mongol confederacy he had created was a military machine unlike anything the medieval world had ever seen. And now it would begin to move. The Mongol Empire was not yet born, but it was about to be. Gentle but clear. Paced slightly slower, there is much to explain here. To understand how Genghis Khan and his Mongols conquered half the known world, we must first understand how they fought. The common image of Mongol warriors is of savage, relentless horsemen, and while there is truth in that, they were indeed fierce and relentless, the reality was far more sophisticated. The Mongol military was built on principles that Genghis Khan had learned through decades of warfare on the steppes. The most fundamental of these was organization. Every warrior was part of a carefully structured hierarchy. 10 men formed a squad, led by a squad commander. 10 squads made a company of 100 with its own commander. 10 companies made a regiment of 1,000. 10 regiments made a tumen, a division of 10,000 warriors. This decimal system allowed for communication, coordination, and the rapid transmission of orders across vast armies. But numbers alone do not explain Mongol success. What truly set them apart was mobility and discipline. A Mongol warrior was born and raised on horseback. He could ride for days with minimal rest, covering distances that would exhaust normal cavalry. He carried with him everything he needed: food, weapons, spare horse equipment. His diet often consisted of dried meat and dried curds that could sustain him on long campaigns. In extreme situations, Mongol warriors could open the veins of their horses and drink the blood, not from cruelty, but from necessity, a practice that horrified settled peoples who heard of it. The Mongol bow was a composite bow, made from horn, sinew, and wood, and it was a masterpiece of engineering. It was stronger than the bows used by peoples to the west, and a skilled Mongol archer could shoot with remarkable accuracy from a moving horse at full gallop. Mongol warriors trained from childhood in archery. They practiced constantly. For them, shooting arrows with precision while riding was as natural as walking. But perhaps the greatest advantage the Mongols possessed was tactical brilliance. Genghis Khan and the military leaders he cultivated had an intuitive understanding of terrain, of how to position forces, of when to strike and when to feign retreat. The feigned retreat, in particular, became a signature Mongol tactic. They would appear to break and flee, drawing pursuers into an ambush. Enemies who expected the Mongols to continue fleeing would suddenly find themselves surrounded and destroyed. This tactic required absolute discipline and trust in the overall commander, something that Genghis Khan had instilled in his forces through years of training and shared victories. In 1205, even before his proclamation as Genghis Khan, Temujin began expanding beyond the steppes. He sent warriors north and east, bringing the scattered tribes of Siberia and the surrounding regions under his control. These expansions were not random raids, but calculated military operations designed to secure his borders and increase his resources. By 1207, Genghis Khan's attention turned westward toward the Tangut kingdom of Xixia, a settled civilization on the edge of Central Asia. Xixia controlled important trade routes and possessed settled agriculture, armies, and treasures that the Mongol Confederation lacked. The Mongol conquest of Xixia was methodical. They did not attack the capital directly, but rather moved through the kingdom, capturing cities one by one, securing lines of supply and communication. This was a new kind of warfare, the warfare of a people in transition from nomadism to empire, learning how to besiege cities and adapt to new kinds of combat. Between 1209 and 1215, Genghis Khan's forces turned their attention to the Jin dynasty of Jurchen people, who controlled northern China. This was a vast undertaking. The Jin dynasty was defended by settled cities, fortified walls, and armies trained in warfare against both nomadic peoples and other sedentary states. The Mongol conquest of Jin territories took years and required the acquisition of new technologies and tactics, including siege equipment. What is remarkable about Genghis Khan's military strategy is that he was a quick learner and an adapter. When he encountered settled warfare, he adopted the technologies and techniques of settled peoples. He employed Chinese engineers who understood siege weaponry, catapults, trebuchets, battering rams. He learned to assault cities, to break walls, to adapt his tactics to environments far different from the open steppes where his people had developed their skills. But the Mongols did not simply adopt the warfare techniques of others. They integrated them into their own system in ways that multiplied their effectiveness. They combined the mobility and discipline of steppe warfare with the technological sophistication of settled warfare. They combined the psychological tactics that had worked on the steppes, feigned retreats, sudden strikes, overwhelming force, with siege equipment and the ability to sustain long campaigns in settled regions. One of the keys to Mongol success was also psychological. When a city heard that the Mongols were coming, they often knew that resistance was likely futile. If a city surrendered, Genghis Khan often allowed the inhabitants to live, and the city was incorporated into his empire with its structures relatively intact. But if a city resisted, the consequences were total. The population would be slaughtered. The city would be razed. This policy served a purpose beyond mere cruelty. It incentivized surrender, which meant that subsequent cities were more likely to give in without a fight. What appeared to outsiders as savagery was actually a calculated military strategy that saved Mongol lives and accelerated conquest. By 1227, when Genghis Khan died, he had created an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Central Asia. His sons and grandsons would expand it further. They would eventually conquer Persia, the Islamic caliphates of the Middle East, and venture deep into Europe. But the foundation of all these conquests was the military system that Genghis Khan himself had created, a system that combined nomadic mobility with organized discipline and tactical brilliance. The conquest of such vast territories was not simply an accident of military superiority. It was the result of a man, Genghis Khan, who had learned from centuries of tribal warfare on the steppes, synthesized that knowledge, and applied it with vision and ruthlessness to the creation of something entirely new. A vast, organized, mobile empire that could move with the speed of a cavalry force and strike with the power of a unified state. This art of conquest would reshape the world. Contemplative, almost philosophical, the listener should feel the weight of organization and vision. When we think of empires, we often picture a single ruler sitting in a capital city, making decisions that ripple outward to distant lands. But the Mongol Empire was fundamentally different. It was an empire of movement and adaptation, and its structure reflected this. Genghis Khan understood that holding such vast territories required more than military force. It required organization, and it required the adaptation of local systems rather than the imposition of a single model everywhere. This flexibility was perhaps the greatest strength of the Mongol Empire, and it is one reason the empire was able to persist and expand so rapidly. The empire was divided into regions called khanates, each typically ruled by one of Genghis Khan's sons or grandsons, though the exact division changed over time and was a constant source of tension. The Golden Horde controlled territories in Russia and western Siberia. Chaghatay's Khanate controlled Central Asia and part of the steppes. The Il Khanate ruled Persia and the surrounding regions. The Great Khan, who was considered the supreme ruler, controlled Mongolia and China. Though they were theoretically united under a single ruler, these khanates gradually became more independent, operating almost as separate states that happened to have a common heritage. Within each khanate, Genghis Khan and his successors adopted local administrative systems rather than trying to impose a uniform Mongol system. This was pragmatic, but it also reflected a kind of respect for local expertise. In China, for instance, the Mongols maintained the bureaucratic systems that had evolved over centuries of Chinese civilization. Chinese officials continued to serve in government, and the civil service examination system persisted, though with some modifications. The Mongols were wise enough to recognize that they did not have the expertise to govern agricultural civilizations and settled peoples. They relied on local peoples to maintain local order. Similarly, in Persia, the Mongols maintained many Persian traditions. They married into the Persian nobility, they patronized Persian culture and learning, and they employed Persian administrators in positions of authority. The result was a fascinating hybrid, a Mongol-Persian culture that produced some of the finest art, architecture, and scholarship of the medieval period. What the Mongols did impose uniformly was the principle of Mongol supremacy. Mongol Khans were considered the rightful rulers of all territory. Mongol princes held the highest positions of authority, and there was a system of tribute and taxation that moved wealth from the subject territories to the Mongol center. But within those broad parameters, remarkable diversity existed. One of the most important Mongol innovations was the establishment of safe trade routes. The Mongol control of vast territories meant that merchants could travel from China to Europe under relatively stable conditions. There were certainly bandits and dangers, but the Mongol military and administrative presence meant that major routes were protected. This gave rise to what we now call the Silk Road in its height, a vast network of trade routes along which goods, people, technologies, and ideas moved from east to west and back again. Imagine being a merchant in this period. You could load goods onto caravans and with some risk travel thousands of miles, knowing that the Mongol state had an interest in protecting trade. You could journey from the ports of southern China through the deserts of Central Asia, across the grasslands of the steppes into Persia, and eventually to the ports of the Mediterranean or the overland routes to Europe. What had previously been a fragmented series of dangerous journeys through hostile or at least neutral territory became, under the Mongols, an integrated system. This opening of trade routes had enormous consequences. Ideas that had been confined to one region could now spread across the world. The compass, gunpowder, and printing technologies moved from China westward. Islamic scientific knowledge moved eastward. Foods, technologies, and artistic traditions mingled in unprecedented ways. The Mongol Empire, for all its violence and destruction, was also a force for unprecedented exchange and connectivity. The Mongols also maintained a system of relay stations, called yam stations, along the major routes of their empire. These stations provided fresh horses, supplies, and shelter to official Mongol messengers. The system meant that important information could be transmitted across the entire empire with remarkable speed. A message sent from the capital could reach distant commanders in weeks rather than months, allowing for better coordination of military and administrative activities. Genghis Khan himself was consumed with the desire for accurate information. He established a network of spies and informants throughout his empire. He wanted to know what was happening in distant territories, whether his governors were serving faithfully or growing corrupt, where resistance might be gathering, where opportunities for expansion might exist. This intelligence network was one of the sophisticated administrative tools that the Mongols developed, reflecting an understanding that an empire of such vast size could not be controlled through military force alone. The Mongols also had a complex legal code known as the Yasa, which Genghis Khan himself created. The Yasa covered everything from military discipline to religious tolerance to marriage laws to the treatment of animals. It was a surprising document in many ways, tolerant of religious diversity, harsh in its punishments for theft and violation of oaths, and deeply practical in its approach to the practical problems of governing a mobile empire. All Mongol subjects, regardless of their position, were theoretically subject to the Yasa, though in practice local laws often superseded it. One distinctive feature of Mongol rule was remarkable religious tolerance. The Mongols themselves had a traditional Tengriist religion, belief in the sky god and ancestor worship, but they showed little interest in forcing this on their subjects. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and other faiths could coexist within the Mongol Empire. This tolerance had a practical dimension. Forcing religious conversion could create resistance and rebellion, but it also reflected something about the Mongol worldview. They were more interested in submission and tribute than in forcing people to believe as they believed. However, this tolerance was not unlimited. The Mongols were fierce in their response to any challenge to their authority, regardless of religious or cultural affiliation. A person or group that refused to submit would be destroyed with utter ruthlessness. But a person or group that submitted could usually maintain their religious beliefs and practices. This was a novel approach at a time when most empires insisted on religious conformity. The structure of the Mongol Empire then was both uniform and diverse. Uniform in its commitment to Mongol supremacy and the maintenance of a vast tribute system. Diverse in its embrace of local customs, religions, and administrative systems. This combination of centralized control and local autonomy allowed the empire to hold together enormous territories populated by peoples with vastly different cultures and traditions. In many ways, the Mongol Empire was ahead of its time in its sophistication. Modern observers sometimes overlook this, focusing only on the violence of conquest. But the persistence of the Mongol-ruled territories and their rapid expansion suggests a system that worked, at least for a time, and worked in ways that allowed genuine exchange and coexistence across vast cultural divides. Pace slightly slower, the listener is settling deeper into sleep. Speak with quiet authority. After the death of Genghis Khan in 1227, the empire he had created faced a crucial test. Would it fragment under competing sons and grandsons, or would it hold together, expanding further? The answer, for a time, was expansion. Genghis Khan's oldest son, Jochi, died before his father, and so the throne passed to Ögedei Khan, the third son. Ögedei was a capable ruler, though he lacked the magnetic authority of his father. Under Ögedei, the Mongol conquests continued to accelerate. Western Persia fell to the Mongols, the Silk Road flourished, and most importantly, the conquest of China intensified. The Jin dynasty in northern China, which had resisted Mongol expansion, finally fell completely in 1234, about 7 years after Genghis Khan's death. But this was only the beginning of the Mongol conquest of China. The Song dynasty still ruled in southern China, and it would take another 40 years of warfare before the Mongols conquered the entire country. This conquest of China was perhaps the most significant achievement of the post-Genghis Khan period, as it placed the Mongols in control of the most sophisticated and wealthy civilization in East Asia. After Ogedei's death in 1241, there was a period of instability as different sons and grandsons vied for power. Eventually, Mungke Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan and the son of Tolui, Genghis Khan's youngest son, became the Great Khan. Mungke was a religious man, deeply interested in comparing different faiths and engaging with the intellectual traditions of the lands he ruled. Under Mungke, the empire continued to expand, and administrative reforms were implemented to improve the organization of the vast territory. But it is Mungke's younger brother, Kublai Khan, who would become the most historically significant of Genghis Khan's successors. Kublai Khan would transform the Mongol Empire into something unprecedented, a Mongol-ruled Chinese empire that would stand as one of the greatest powers the world has ever seen. Kublai Khan was born around 1215 and spent much of his youth in Central Asia and Mongolia, learning the ways of the Mongol warrior and administrator. He was more educated and more cosmopolitan than many of his predecessors, and he had a fascination with Chinese civilization and administration. When his brother Mungke became Great Khan, Kublai was given the task of administering the newly conquered territories in northern China and expanding the conquest into southern China. It was a task that would occupy him for decades. The conquest of the Song dynasty was not quick or easy. The Song were a cultured people with a strong naval tradition, and their heartland in southern China was difficult to conquer. The Mongols had to learn naval warfare, something that did not come naturally to steppe warriors. They had to adapt their tactics to the geography of southern China, with its rivers, lakes, and dense vegetation. It was a process of continuous learning and adaptation, and it took decades of warfare to finally achieve complete victory. In 1259, while Kublai was still engaged in the conquest of southern China, his brother Mungke died. This triggered a succession dispute. Kublai's other brothers also claimed the right to be Great Khan. There was a period of civil war, with Kublai fighting against his younger brother, Arig Boka, for the throne. This was a critical moment in the history of the Mongol Empire, a moment when it could have fragmented. But Kublai, through a combination of superior military force and superior diplomatic maneuvering, defeated his rivals and secured his position as Great Khan by 1264. With his position secured, Kublai could now focus on completing the conquest of China. By 1279, the last Song resistance was crushed, and Kublai Khan became the ruler of all China. He established a new dynasty, the Yuan dynasty, with himself as emperor. Remarkably, he maintained the Chinese administrative system, the Chinese calendar, and many Chinese customs, even as he established Mongol rule. This was a pragmatic decision. The Mongols were outnumbered by Chinese by perhaps 40-1, and trying to impose Mongol culture would have created constant resistance. Kublai Khan established his capital at Khanbalik, which later became known as Beijing. This city was built according to Mongol designs but incorporated Chinese architectural traditions. It was a cosmopolitan center, attracting merchants, scholars, and adventurers from across the known world. Among these was Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant whose travel account would later introduce Europeans to the wonders of East Asia. Under Kublai Khan, the Yuan dynasty flourished. The Mongol control of vast territories meant that trade flourished. The Great Khan maintained a vast bureaucracy, employing not only Mongols, but also Chinese and Central Asian administrators. He supported scholarship and the arts. He maintained a sophisticated legal system, and he ruled over a territory that was wealthier and more powerful than any other empire of the time. The reign of Kublai Khan also saw the development of distinctive Yuan culture, a synthesis of Mongol and Chinese traditions. Mongol military practices influenced Chinese warfare. Chinese artistic traditions influenced Mongol aesthetics. The result was a unique cultural moment where two great civilizations came together, not without tensions and difficulties, but with genuine exchange and creativity. It was during Kublai Khan's reign that the Mongol Empire reached its greatest extent. The empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Black Sea, from Siberia to Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean. Never before in history had a single political entity controlled so vast a territory. And at the heart of this empire was China, under the rule of a Mongol Khan who had made himself a Chinese emperor. Yet even at the height of Kublai Khan's power, there were signs of future fragmentation. The empire was so vast that communication between the different khanates was becoming more difficult. The khanates of the West, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Il Khanate in Persia, were increasingly independent. They paid lip service to Kublai Khan as the supreme ruler, but in reality, they were developing their own interests and their own priorities. Kublai Khan ruled until his death in 1294. After his death, the Yuan dynasty continued, but the vitality seemed to drain from it. His successors were often less capable, and the empire faced increasing internal challenges. In the West, the Il Khanate fragmented. The Golden Horde, still powerful in Russia, developed into an independent state. The Chagatai Khanate remained largely in the hands of Central Asian Mongols and became increasingly Islamic in character. But in this period of Kublai Khan's rule, from his consolidation of power until his death, the Mongol Empire was something almost miraculous. A vast, relatively stable, cosmopolitan empire that connected the world in ways that would not be matched until the 19th century. Goods, ideas, technologies, and people moved across this empire with unprecedented freedom. It was not a golden age. Mongol rule was often harsh, and the Mongols themselves were gradually being absorbed into the cultures they ruled. But it was an age of great achievement and connection. Warm, with a sense of vast distances, the listener should feel the expanse of the steppe. While Kublai Khan was consolidating Mongol rule in China, the western portions of the Mongol Empire were expanding in their own dramatic fashion. To understand this expansion, we must return to the period shortly after Genghis Khan's death, when the Mongol armies swept westward with an unstoppable force. In 1236, a massive Mongol army, numbering perhaps 150,000 warriors, assembled under the command of Batu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan and the son of Jochi. The purpose of this expedition was to consolidate Mongol control over the steppes and forest regions to the west of Mongolia, and to bring the rich kingdoms and lands of Eastern Europe under Mongol rule. This would become known as the conquest of the Kipchak steppes and the invasion of Europe. The Mongol warriors who invaded Europe were not unsophisticated raiders. They were the inheritors of the military traditions of Genghis Khan, disciplined, organized, and equipped with weapons and tactics that European armies had never encountered. The first years of the campaign were spent consolidating Mongol control over the steppes and the regions of what is now southern Russia. By 1237, the Mongols had established a secure base of operations from which they could launch attacks into Europe proper. In 1237, the Mongols invaded the Russian territories. This was not a quick conquest. It took them years to subdue the various Russian principalities, which were divided among themselves and therefore unable to mount a unified defense. The Mongol armies moved from city to city, laying siege and burning, destroying the centers of Russian power. Among the cities that fell was Kiev, which had once been the heart of Russian civilization. When the Mongols finally conquered Kiev in 1240, they slaughtered much of the population and left the city in ruins. For the next 2.5 centuries, Russia would be under Mongol rule, a period that Russian historians often call the Tatar yoke. From the base of operations in Russia, the Mongol armies pressed further westward. In 1241, they invaded Poland and Hungary. European knights and armies marched to meet them, hoping to stop the invasion. But European warfare and European armies were fundamentally different from the Mongol style of warfare that they encountered. Heavily armored knights, charging in formation, were no match for highly mobile mounted archers who could strike from a distance and scatter away before the European forces could engage them directly. At the Battle of Liegnitz in Poland in 1241, a combined army of Polish and German knights was decisively defeated by the Mongols. On the same day in Hungary, another major battle was fought, and again the Mongols were victorious. These victories sent shockwaves through Europe. The reality that seemed to be spreading across Christendom was that the Mongols were unstoppable, and that Europe itself might soon be conquered. But the conquest of Europe did not happen. The Mongol armies, at the height of their European victories, suddenly withdrew. The reason, in part, was the death of Ögedei Khan in Mongolia in 1241. The Khan's sons had to return to Mongolia to attend the succession meeting. The Mongol army in Europe was recalled. They did not return. Why did they not return? This has puzzled historians for centuries. The Mongols were certainly capable of conquering Europe. Many scholars believe that had they chosen to, they could have done so. But Europe was not wealthy enough, not organized enough, and not strategically important enough to warrant the effort. The Mongols had achieved what they wanted, the subjugation of Russia and the peripheral regions of Eastern Europe. They had access to the steppes, which were rich in resources and good for their cavalry forces. Europe, with its forests and mountains and settled kingdoms, was less attractive, and so the Mongol expansion into Europe stopped, leaving European civilization to develop along its own path. The result of this Mongol conquest of Russia and the western steppes was the establishment of what became known as the Golden Horde, a Mongol khanate named perhaps after the golden tents of the Khans or the golden hue of the grasslands in autumn. The Golden Horde was ruled by Batu Khan and his successors, and it became one of the great powers of medieval Europe and Asia. The Golden Horde, which was also called the Kipchak Khanate, eventually became the largest and longest-lasting of the four major Mongol khanates. At its height, it stretched from the Black Sea to Siberia and from the Caucasus Mountains to the steppes of Central Asia. It was ruled from a capital city called Sarai, which became a major center of trade and culture, drawing merchants and scholars from across Europe, Asia, and the Islamic world. Under the rule of the Golden Horde, Russia was transformed. Russian principalities were allowed to maintain their own rulers and their own internal affairs as long as they paid tribute to the Khan and obeyed his orders in matters of foreign policy and military affairs. The Mongols levied taxes on the Russian territories, and in return they provided a kind of order and protection against external invasion. The Mongol control was absolute in some ways. Disobedience could be punished with total destruction, but in other ways it was surprisingly light. Local nobles were allowed to rule their own lands. The Orthodox Church was generally tolerated, and Russian culture continued to develop and evolve. The long-term effects of Mongol rule on Russia were profound. The Mongols cut Russia off from much of the cultural and economic development that was occurring in Western Europe during this period. Russia did not experience the Renaissance. The feudal systems of Russia developed differently from those of Western Europe, more hierarchical and more centralized, perhaps influenced by the Mongol model of rule. And the Russian state itself was shaped by the Mongol experience, with an emphasis on strong central authority and a tradition of accepting power from external forces that would persist for centuries. The Golden Horde itself became increasingly Islamic over time. Many of the Mongol elite converted to Islam, especially as they intermarried with Turkish and other Islamic peoples of Central Asia. By the 14th century, the Golden Horde was for practical purposes an Islamic state, ruled by Mongol descendants, but administered according to Islamic law and traditions. The Mongol language gradually gave way to Turkic languages, and the culture became increasingly Islamic. However, the Golden Horde remained a crucial link in the vast Mongol trade network. Caravans could travel from China through the Golden Horde's territories into Europe and the Islamic world. The Khan's Road, as it was sometimes called, was protected and maintained, and merchants knew that if they followed these routes, they would be under the protection of the Khan's authority. The Golden Horde would persist as a major power for more than 2 centuries after its establishment. Gradually, as central Mongol authority weakened and local powers reasserted themselves, the Khanate fragmented. The Ottoman Empire rose in the south and eventually conquered many of the Golden Horde's southern territories. Muscovy, the principality centered on Moscow, gradually accumulated power and began to throw off Mongol rule. By the 15th century, the Golden Horde was in decline, and by the 16th century, it had ceased to exist as a coherent political entity. But the impact of the Golden Horde on the history of Europe and Asia was immense. It had connected the East and West, facilitated trade and cultural exchange, and shaped the development of Russia and Central Asia. In many ways, the consequences of the Golden Horde's rule would persist for centuries after the Khanate itself had disappeared. The Western conquests of the Mongol Empire, then, were not the beginning of European conquest, but rather the consolidation of vast territories in Russia and Central Asia under a single Mongol Khan. These territories would become a crucial link in the chain that connected the great powers of Europe and Asia, and they would shape the future course of European and Asian history. Contemplative, with a sense of cultural blending. Speak of art and learning. While Kublai Khan was establishing his empire in China and Batu Khan's descendants were ruling the steppes of the Golden Horde, another branch of the Mongol family was creating an empire in the Islamic heartland. This was the Il Khanate, a term that comes from Il, meaning family or tribe, and Khan, the Mongol title of ruler. In many ways, the Ilkhanate would become the most culturally sophisticated of the Mongol states, producing some of the greatest achievements in medieval Islamic art, science, and learning. The Ilkhanate was established following the Mongol conquest of Persia and the surrounding regions in the 1250s and 1260s. The conquests of these regions were brutal. Entire cities were destroyed, populations were slaughtered, and the region was devastated by warfare. But once the conquest was complete, the Mongol rulers who established themselves in Persia took a surprising interest in the sophisticated civilization they had conquered. The founder of the Ilkhanate was Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan and the brother of Mongke Khan. Hulagu was given the task of subjugating the Islamic world to the west of the Chagatai Khanate. He accomplished this with characteristic Mongol ferocity. In 1256, he launched an assault on the Assassins, a secretive Islamic religious sect that had long been a thorn in the side of Islamic rulers. The Mongols destroyed the Assassins in their mountain fortresses, eliminating them from history. In 1258, Hulagu's armies reached Baghdad, the great capital of the Islamic world and the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate. Baghdad at this time was more of a symbolic capital than a real center of power. The Abbasid Caliphate had long been in decline, with real power dispersed among various local rulers and the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt. But Baghdad still retained enormous cultural and religious significance as the seat of the Islamic Caliph. The Mongol siege of Baghdad was devastating. The city was surrounded, and its defenders, seeing that they could not hold out, sued for terms. The Caliph, an old man, eventually surrendered, hoping to save the city. But Hulagu's forces showed no mercy. The city was sacked. Hundreds of thousands were killed. Some accounts claim the numbers were much higher, though these are likely exaggerated. The great libraries of Baghdad, repositories of Islamic and earlier Greek and Persian learning accumulated over centuries, were destroyed or scattered. The Tigris River is said to have run black with ink from the books that were thrown into it. The destruction of Baghdad was seen throughout the Islamic world as a catastrophe. The Caliph himself was executed. The symbolic center of Islamic civilization had been conquered and destroyed by infidel invaders. The shock was profound and lasting. However, the Ilkhanate did not pursue further conquest into the Islamic heartland. Instead, Hulagu established his capital in Persia at a city called Maraga. This is where something remarkable happened. Despite the violence of conquest, Hulagu and his successors became patrons of Islamic culture. They married into the Persian and Islamic nobility. They patronized scholars, artists, and craftsmen. They built palaces and gardens in the Persian style. They supported the study of astronomy, mathematics, and other sciences. The Ilkhans did not attempt to impose Mongol culture on Persia. Instead, they were gradually absorbed into Persian Islamic culture, even as they maintained their political authority as Mongol rulers. The most famous of the Ilkhan rulers was Ghazan Khan, who ruled from 1295 until 1304. Ghazan Khan was a remarkable figure. He was educated in Islamic learning and law. He became genuinely devoted to Islam and promoted it actively throughout his territories. He reformed the administration, implementing new systems of taxation and land distribution. He supported scholarship and learning, and he was a military reformer who made significant changes to Mongol military organization. improving the effectiveness of mounted archery and cavalry tactics. Under Ghazan Khan, the Ilkhanate produced some of the greatest achievements of medieval Islamic civilization. Artists and craftsmen produced works of extraordinary beauty. Miniaturists created illuminated manuscripts that are still considered masterpieces. Architects designed buildings that synthesized Mongol, Persian, and Islamic styles. Scholars in mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy made significant contributions to human knowledge. One of the most important of these scholarly achievements was the work done at the Maraga Observatory, which Hulagu Khan had founded. Here, under the direction of Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, a brilliant mathematician and astronomer, scholars gathered to study the heavens and to advance the mathematical and astronomical knowledge that had been accumulated in Islamic civilization. The work done at Maraga was influential not only in the Islamic world, but eventually contributed to the development of astronomy in Europe as well. The Ilkhanate also became a crucial link in the Silk Road trade network. The city of Tabriz became a major center of international commerce, where goods from China could be exchanged for goods from Europe, and where merchants could mingle with scholars and craftspeople. The Ilkhanate maintained diplomatic relations with major powers, including Venice and other European states, and was incorporated into the vast trade networks that the Mongol Empire had created. Like the other Mongol Khanates, the Ilkhanate was not politically stable. The succession of rulers after Ghazan Khan was marked by instability and fragmentation. The Khanate experienced periods of rapid succession, with weak rulers following strong ones. The Ilkhan's authority over the various regional governors and military commanders gradually weakened, and gradually the Islamic world reasserted itself. Local Islamic rulers, particularly the Ottoman Empire in Anatolia, began to challenge Mongol authority. By the early 14th century, the Ilkhanate was fragmenting. By the mid-14th century, it had effectively ceased to exist as a unified political entity. Persia and the Islamic world returned to a state of political fragmentation, with various Islamic dynasties and sultanates competing for power. But the legacy of the Ilkhanate remained. The synthesis of Mongol and Islamic culture that occurred during the Ilkhanate's rule was one of the most creative cultural moments in medieval history. Art, architecture, literature, and scholarship all flourished. The Mongols, despite their reputation for destroying civilization, had in this case become patrons of one of the world's great civilizations and had allowed themselves to be transformed by it. The Ilkhanate's history shows us an important truth about the Mongol Empire. While the Mongols were ferocious conquerors, they were not agents of cultural destruction. They were adaptable enough to take on the cultures they conquered. They were pragmatic enough to recognize that patronizing learning and the arts served their own interests. And they were successful enough in conquering and ruling vast territories to allow for the flourishing of sophisticated civilizations within their domains. In many ways, the Ilkhanate's achievements in art, science, and culture were as significant as any military conquest. And they represent one of the most important legacies of the Mongol Empire, not what it destroyed, but what it enabled to be created. Warm, almost wondrous. Speak of distances and meeting points. Beneath all the violence of Mongol conquest and all the military organization of the empire lay something perhaps even more revolutionary than the military itself, the opening of trade routes that connected the entire known world in ways that had never existed before. For centuries before the Mongol conquests, trade had existed between East and West. Chinese goods had found their way to Rome and the Mediterranean world. Islamic merchants had connected the Indian Ocean to the Middle East, but these trade routes were fragmented, dangerous, and controlled by multiple intermediaries. A merchant in Venice might wish to obtain spices from Southeast Asia or silks from China, but the journey was long, dangerous, and profit margins were uncertain. Goods passed through many hands, each adding markups and costs. Political divisions meant that traders often had to navigate through hostile territories or pay exorbitant tolls to local rulers. The Mongol conquest of vast territories changed this dramatically. Suddenly, there existed a single political entity that controlled trade routes stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the Mediterranean. The Mongol Khans had an interest in promoting trade because trade generated tax revenue. A merchant who successfully conducted trade would pay taxes to the Khan. A merchant who was robbed would pay nothing. The security provided by the Mongol Empire meant that merchants could now undertake journeys that would have been far too risky before. Caravans could travel across the steppes under Mongol protection. They could cross deserts knowing that Mongol-protected caravanserais, way stations, would provide shelter and fresh horses. The roads themselves were marked and maintained. Merchants could travel with relative security and with a reasonable expectation that they would arrive at their destination and be able to conduct business. The result was an explosion of trade. Goods that had once been luxuries available only to the wealthiest began to circulate more widely. Spices from Southeast Asia, which had been fabulously expensive, became more affordable, though still costly. Silk production in China continued to flourish, and now Chinese silks could reach European markets more easily and more cheaply than before. Chinese ceramics, particularly porcelain, became sought after in the Islamic world and eventually in Europe as well. The most famous traveler of this era was Marco Polo, a Venetian merchant whose account of his journey to China and his years in the court of Kublai Khan became legendary. Marco Polo left Venice in 1271 with his father Niccolo and uncle Maffeo, who were experienced traders with contacts in the East. The journey took more than 3 years, and they traveled across Persia, through high mountain passes, across deserts, and finally to the court of Kublai Khan in China. Marco Polo spent more than 20 years in the service of Kublai Khan, traveling to various parts of the empire, conducting business and observing the sophisticated civilization of China. His account, which was eventually written down by a Genoese writer after Marco Polo's return to Italy, provided Europeans with detailed information about the wealth, sophistication, and organization of Chinese civilization. The account inspired future explorers and traders and contributed to the geographic knowledge that would eventually lead to the Age of Exploration. The Silk Road was not a single road, but a network of routes, some following ancient paths, some newly opened by the security provided by the Mongol Empire. There were northern routes that crossed the steppes. There were southern routes that went through deserts and oases. There were maritime routes that took advantage of Indian Ocean trade. These routes connected major trading cities: Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, Chang'an, modern-day Xi'an, Baghdad, Constantinople, and many others. At these trading cities, merchants from different lands met and exchanged goods. Ideas were also exchanged. Religious ideas, particularly Buddhism, which had long been present in Central Asia, now spread northward and eastward. Islamic ideas spread eastward along the same routes. And secular knowledge, astronomical observations, mathematical techniques, medicinal knowledge also flowed along the trade routes. The transfer of technologies is perhaps one of the most important legacies of the open Silk Road under the Mongols. Gunpowder, which had been invented in China, began to spread westward. The compass, another Chinese invention, became known in the Islamic world and eventually in Europe. These technologies would prove revolutionary, eventually transforming warfare and enabling European exploration of the world. Agricultural products also traveled along the Silk Road. Crops that had originated in one region could now spread to another. This exchange of crops and agricultural knowledge had profound long-term consequences. Crops from the Americas, which would arrive in Europe centuries later through different routes, would have similar transformative effects, but the Mongol-era trade routes carried crops and seeds from across Eurasia as well. The human impact of this trade was also significant. Merchants established communities far from their homelands. Venetian merchants established colonies in the Black Sea region, even during Mongol rule. Genoese merchants were active in the same region. Chinese merchants ventured westward. Islamic merchants moved eastward. This created communities of foreign merchants in distant cities, communities that maintained connections to their homelands while becoming integrated into local economies and social structures. The Mongol postal system also facilitated communication over vast distances. Officials and merchants could send written messages and receive responses in weeks rather than months. This allowed for more rapid communication of news, prices, and information than had been possible before. A merchant in Venice could receive information about market conditions in China faster than would be possible later during periods of political fragmentation. The opening of trade routes also had military and political consequences. Goods that had been rare and precious became more available, changing wealth distribution and status hierarchies. The increased availability of Asian goods in Europe created demand for exotic products and stimulated European interest in establishing direct trade relationships with Asia, bypassing Islamic intermediaries. This interest would eventually contribute to the motivation for European exploration. The Mongol Peace, as it has sometimes been called, created an unprecedented moment in world history when a single political entity controlled trade routes connecting most of the known world. This moment was relatively brief, lasting only a few centuries before the Mongol Empire fragmented and political divisions re-emerged. But in those few centuries, the effects were profound. The world was connected in new ways. Ideas, technologies, and goods circulated with unprecedented freedom. Yet it is important to note that the peace was built on conquest and maintained through military force. The benefits of trade accrued primarily to the wealthy, merchants and rulers, while ordinary people bore much of the burden through taxes and military service. And as the next section will show, the very success of the Mongol Empire in creating these trade networks would eventually contribute to phenomena such as the spread of disease that would have devastating consequences. Contemplative, almost elegiac, a sense of endings and lasting consequences. The Mongol Empire was not destined to last forever. Like all empires, it contained within itself the seeds of its own dissolution. And yet, though the empire fragmented and eventually disappeared, its legacy endured in profound ways that shaped the future course of human civilization. The first signs of fragmentation began to appear even during the lifetime of Kublai Khan. The four main khanates, the Yuan dynasty in China, the Golden Horde in Russia and the steppes, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Ilkhanate in Persia, had always been theoretically united under a single supreme Khan. But as the empire became so vast that communication between distant regions became difficult, and as each Khanate faced its own local challenges and opportunities, the centrifugal forces gradually overcome the centripetal ones. After the death of Kublai Khan in 1294, the Yuan dynasty in China continued, but it lost the dynamic leadership that had characterized Kublai's reign. Successive Khans proved less capable, and internal divisions within the Mongol elite made unified decision-making more difficult. The Yuan dynasty faced challenges from rising Chinese powers and from internal corruption and instability. By the 14th century, Mongol rule in China was weakening. In 1368, Chinese rebel forces led by the Ming dynasty finally overthrew Mongol rule in China. The Yuan dynasty collapsed. The Mongol rulers retreated northward, back to Mongolia itself, where they would persist as a political entity but never again exercise the power they had once held. The loss of China was catastrophic for the broader Mongol Empire, because China had been the richest and most powerful component of it. In Persia, the Ilkhanate had already fragmented earlier in the 14th century. By the early 1400s, the region had returned to a state of political fragmentation, with various Persian and Turkish dynasties competing for power. The Ottoman Empire, which had begun its rise in Anatolia, would eventually become the dominant power in the region, conquering Constantinople in 1453 and establishing itself as a major world power. The Golden Horde in Russia remained a major power longer than the other khanates. It persisted well into the 15th century as a coherent political entity. But gradually, the principalities of Russia, particularly Moscow, accumulated power and began to assert their independence. By the 15th century, Russian rulers no longer accepted Mongol suzerainty. The Khan's authority had become nominal. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia persisted longest as a territorial entity, but it fragmented into smaller regional powers. The term Chagatai eventually came to refer not primarily to a political entity, but to a cultural and linguistic zone. The Chagatai Turkic language, which was spoken throughout Central Asia and parts of China, was named after the original Chagatai Khanate. By the 16th century, The Mongol Empire had effectively ceased to exist as a political entity. The Mongol people themselves had been absorbed into the peoples around them, though they maintained their own identity and culture. What had once seemed like the inevitable wave of the future, Mongol conquest and Mongol rule, had receded into history. Yet the legacy of the Mongol Empire was immense and lasting. Politically, the empire had reshaped the map of the world. Russia had been united under Mongol rule and would maintain a more centralized, hierarchical political structure than it might otherwise have developed. China had been conquered and ruled by non-Chinese conquerors, an experience that would influence Chinese political thought and practice. The Middle East had been devastated and reconstructed under Mongol rule, and the cultural synthesis that occurred in the Ilkhanate had contributed significantly to Islamic civilization. Economically, the opening of trade routes had created new patterns of commerce and exchange that would persist long after Mongol political control had ended. The maritime routes that connected Europe, the Middle East, India, and Asia would be further developed and exploited in the following centuries. The interest that European traders had developed in direct trade with Asia, stimulated by knowledge of Asian wealth and sophistication gained during the Mongol period, would eventually lead to the Age of Exploration in the 15th and 16th centuries. Culturally, the Mongol Empire had been an agent of transmission and synthesis. It had carried technologies, knowledge, and artistic traditions across vast distances. The influence of Chinese technology, particularly in areas like gunpowder weapons and printing, had spread westward. Islamic scientific and mathematical knowledge had spread eastward and northward. Buddhist art and philosophy had spread along the Silk Road. The result was a more interconnected world, where ideas and techniques from different civilizations could encounter one another and influence one another. There is a darker legacy as well. The Mongol conquests had been extraordinarily destructive. Tens of millions of people were killed. Some scholars estimate the numbers were higher than any war until the 20th century. Entire civilizations were devastated. Great cities were destroyed and burned. Libraries were destroyed. The knowledge and culture that had accumulated in those places was lost. The world was unified under Mongol rule, but at an enormous human cost. Moreover, the opening of trade routes under Mongol rule had unforeseen consequences. Merchant ships and caravans do not travel alone. They carry diseases as well as goods. In the mid-14th century, the plague, the Black Death, spread along the Mongol open trade routes from its origin in Central Asia or China to the Middle East and Europe. In Europe, the plague killed perhaps 25 to 50% of the population. In the Islamic world in China, the death toll was also catastrophic. This pandemic, facilitated by the very trade routes that the Mongols had opened, was one of the most destructive events in human history. The plague contributed to the weakening of both the Islamic world and Europe in the 14th century, and it may have contributed to the ultimate failure of the Mongol Empire to maintain its vast territorial holdings. The plague killed Mongol warriors as readily as anyone else. The economic disruption caused by the plague made the maintenance of the vast bureaucratic structures that the Mongols had established more difficult. Yet, despite these tragic consequences, the Mongol Empire's legacy in world history is complex. The empire had been remarkable for its extent, its organization, and its openness to cultural synthesis. It had created possibilities for exchange and communication that had not existed before. It had demonstrated that vast territories with different cultures and religions could be governed under a single political authority. This lesson would influence later empires and political thinkers. The Mongols themselves, though they had been gradually absorbed into the cultures they conquered, left a lasting mark on many civilizations. In Russia, the concept of absolute rule, of a powerful central authority that could command obedience, was perhaps influenced by the Mongol model. In China, the experience of being ruled by foreign conquerors influenced how Chinese rulers thought about governance and loyalty. In the Islamic world, the synthesis of cultures that occurred in the Ilkhanate contributed to the continuing vibrancy of Islamic civilization. In a real sense, the modern world, with its global trade networks, its exchange of ideas across vast distances, and its interconnectedness, has roots in the Mongol era. The Mongols did not create this world, but they created the conditions that made it possible. They opened the roads that would be traveled for centuries to come, even after Mongol rule had ended. They demonstrated that a single political authority could govern vast territories containing different peoples and religions, and they facilitated the movement of goods, technologies, and ideas across continents in ways that had lasting consequences. The Mongol Empire was ultimately a transitional moment in world history. It was a bridge between the more fragmented medieval world and the more connected world that would emerge in the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration. Though the empire itself did not last, though the Mongols were gradually absorbed into the peoples around them, the world they had helped to create, more connected, more exchanging goods and ideas, more unified by trade and communication, that world persisted. And so when we look back on the Mongol Empire today, we should see not simply a conquered or a conqueror, not simply violence and destruction, though those were certainly present. We should see a remarkable moment in human history when a single political entity united a vast portion of the known world, when trade routes were opened and made relatively safe, when different cultures and religions coexisted and learned from one another, when the world itself became more connected. That moment is past. The empire has dissolved. The Khans have receded into history. But the world they created, more interconnected, more exchanging ideas and technologies, more aware of the vast diversity of human civilization, that world remains with us still. Very slow, very warm, voice dropping gradually in volume, a sense of returning, of peace. And now, as this telling comes to an end, let yourself return. Return slowly from the grasslands of Mongolia, from the courts of Kublai Khan, from the devastated cities of Baghdad and Kiev. Return to the present moment. Feel your body again. Feel the surface beneath you. Solid, stable, real. Notice the rhythm of your breathing. Inhale and exhale. The story of the Mongol Empire is now behind you, settled into memory like sediment on the bed of a river, forming new layers of understanding. You have traveled through nearly 8 centuries, from the 12th century to the present. You have witnessed the rise of a man born in obscurity, who became Genghis Khan and unified the scattered tribes of the grasslands. You have seen the conquest of vast territories, the establishment of trade routes, the synthesis of cultures, the creation of an empire that stretched from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. You have learned that empires, no matter how vast, no matter how powerful, are temporal things. They rise, they flourish, and they inevitably decline. But the effects of their existence persist. The Mongol Empire is gone. The Khans are dust. Their cities, some of them, are ruins. But the world they created, more connected, more aware of its own diversity, more capable of exchange, that world is our world. Feel the weight of history settle gently upon you, not as a burden, but as a gift. The knowledge that you carry now, the understanding of these vast events, these remarkable people, these profound transformations, this knowledge is yours to keep. It will change how you understand the world, how you think about power and culture and human possibility. Let yourself sink deeper now. Feel the heaviness of sleep approaching. Your eyes are heavy. Your limbs are warm and comfortable. The story has been told. The journey is complete. In the darkness behind your closed eyes, you can see, if you choose, the vast grasslands of Mongolia, the wind across the steppes, a rider on horseback disappearing into the distance, the sound of a horse's hoofbeats growing fainter and fainter. And now, let go. Let sleep come. Let your mind and body rest in the knowledge that you have journeyed far and learned much. The empire of the Mongols endures in history, and you, peaceful listener, are safe now in the present moment. Held gently by the darkness, by comfort, by the knowledge that you have witnessed something great and have brought it safely home in your memory. Sleep now. Rest now. And in your sleep, perhaps you will dream of ancient grasslands, of great rulers and vast journeys, of a world connected by trade and illuminated by the exchange of knowledge and culture. Let these dreams be gentle. Let them be profound. The night is long. Sleep well. All is well.